Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, July 11th, 1940, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt is faced with a big decision, and he has a long conversation with Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter. Now, 2 things right off the bat about this. Number 1, Felix Frankfurter, great name. Let's put it on that list of great names. I hope some listener out there is keeping that list. And number 2 is, what was FDR's big decision? Well, it was whether to run for a 3rd term. FDR would, of course, do that and win, and then run for a 4th term and win. And then they amended the Constitution and said you can only serve 2 terms. But let's stay in this moment, FDR's decision to run again, and why this conversation with Felix Frankfurter convinced him that he could and should. So here to do that are, as always, Nicole Hammer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So, Niki, do you want to just start off with basically setting out that I think we should probably establish right off the bat that at this moment in time, a president only serves for 2 terms thing was more of a precedent than anything. It's like, seems to be one of these classic norm instead of a law kind of situations, right?
Yeah, that always works out so well.
Yes.
Yes, and we know that because a couple of presidents before Franklin Roosevelt had tried to do this. One was Ulysses S. Grant, who didn't succeed in getting nominated. And then one was Teddy Roosevelt, who also didn't succeed in getting nominated, but he ran as a third-party candidate and actually came in second. So Americans weren't too turned off by the idea of a Roosevelt, at least, running for a 3rd term. Mm-hmm. And so as Franklin Roosevelt is contemplating this, he sits down in the study off of the Oval Office with a Supreme Court Justice, Felix Frankfurter, and asks him, basically, they talk for 2 hours about, is this something that I can actually do? Is this constitutionally sound? And look, FDR was someone who had a few run-ins with his Supreme Court. He wanted to make sure that he was on solid ground going into this legally before he pursued the nomination.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but it does feel like a lot of the sort of conventional wisdom or whatever about, oh, you should only run for 2 terms comes from George Washington, who I think kind of famously said, oh, I'm going to not run again and I'm going to step down after 2 terms. And I would just say incidentally, over the course of doing this show, I've started to come to this notion that George Washington does a lot of very noble things, but also likes to let people know that he's doing a lot of those noble things. And this seemed like one of those moments where he made a big show and a big proclamation of the fact that he felt for the security of the democracy, of the new democracy, that he would only serve 2 terms.
But to be fair, George Washington didn't really want to be president, and he made that very clear. And so his decision to not run for a 3rd term was in large in part motivated from the fact that he didn't really want to be president. So I think that sort of should, have its own space. But I think it's very clear that FDR wants to be president and is trying to find people, highly effective people like a Supreme Court justice, that can affirm his decision to run, and so that he knows that he has support. So basically, FDR is not going to stick his neck out unless he knows that he will be protected in his attempt to run.
And that support is really necessary precisely because of that George Washington precedent, because it wasn't just that Washington left after 2 terms and that became the standard. It became part of the mythology around American democracy, that a leader would willingly give up power. And so that's what each successive president did after serving a second term, was even though there wasn't any law there, he willingly gave up power. And that reaffirmed this idea of a kind of limit to democracy and a kind of selflessness and statesmanship that was so foundational. And in fact, when Teddy Roosevelt violates that idea by running for a third term in 1912, he's shot. The person who tries to assassinate Teddy Roosevelt does so because for a lot of reasons, but says that they do so because he's running for a third term and threatening American democracy.
Incidentally, I'll point out that even when there is a law, as there is now, we see that sometimes there isn't that sort of willingness to give up power, and even laws themselves can get tested by a president who wants to hold on to power. That's another show, more recent history. Back to 1940, I think that there's this bigger question that seems to be swirling around here of why Roosevelt wanted to run again, how much he sort of had made up his mind and was looking for cover. And I don't know, maybe I'm in a cynical mood today. I've already sort of talked smack about George Washington, but it's part of me reading this story feels like here's a guy who wants to run again, and he's yanking in this Supreme Court justice to give him cover for a decision that he's already made. Though I do also gather that maybe there is a little bit more nuance about whether and why FDR felt called to extend his term.
Yeah, if I could give a more optimistic angle, I would say that we have to remember the country's still in a depression. Like the country is still fighting for its economic stability in the 30s. It's really World War II that sort of pulls us out of this. But then we're on the precipice of that by 1940. And so in terms of the United States entering the war, and I think FDR also says to himself, I can't leave the country on the brink of war or on the precipice, on the beginnings of war. And so he feels that his leadership is vital to getting America fully out of this depression and also leading America through this war with Europe that becomes World War II and Nazi Germany and so forth and so on.
Yeah, I think the war is a big part of it, and so is domestic politics. So the Republican Party in 1940 is deciding between Robert Taft and Wendell Willkie. Wilkie's kind of a dark horse, but and Taft seemed like he was in a good position to become the nominee, and he was somebody who you could call him an isolationist, you could call him a non-interventionist, but he was somebody who was probably going to withdraw the U.S. even more. And Roosevelt had been pushing further and further into helping out the countries that would become the Allies. And so there's a sense not only that the U.S. is in danger and that the world stage is incredibly unstable, but Roosevelt has a self-conception that, if the other guy wins, the U.S. is going to be in much more danger. The world is going to be in much more peril. And so he has to run again in order to keep the country and the world safe.
Yeah, a political and moral obligation to run.
So what do you make of that rationale? Because I think that when I think of FDR, certainly his first two terms, I think of him as really someone who was righting the ship domestically. And so now, to hinge this pressing need to run for a third term on a foreign threat, I guess the question is, was he really the best person for the job to handle a growing threat?
I mean, I don't think we know the answer to that. And I don't think we can know because if other Republican leaders have this isolationist stance, they're not going to want to engage. I don't think that there was anyone in the Democratic Party, other than maybe his vice president, John Nance Garner, saw himself as a potential successor, saw himself with the ability to say, okay, this is my moment. But we can never know.
And I would say maybe two things in addition to that. And that is that Roosevelt had been pretty carefully navigating the U.S.'s relationship to the outbreak of war in Europe. So, getting rid of, moving into Lend-Lease, doing more and more to become economically entangled in what was happening. And so it is true that he wasn't known as a foreign policy president, but he had been probably since 1935 or so, thinking more and more about the U.S.'s relationship to the world stage. But also, I think we have to make some room here for Roosevelt's ego. Like, he's somebody who didn't trust his vice presidents. This was especially true for his vice president in 1944, Harry S. Truman, who he never included in his inner circle. It takes a lot of ego to run for president in the first place. It takes much more to run a third and a fourth time. He had been hailed as somebody and denounced as somebody who might be a dictator, and certainly, stirred the pot on that again by running for a third term. But even with those concerns floating in the air, he ran anyway. So he was definitely someone who thought, if not, I alone can fix this. Certainly felt he was well positioned to fix things.
And it's not like there were a ton of other great candidates who were good options. I mean, the Republicans run Wendell Willkie, and Roosevelt's campaign against Wendell Willkie is like, well, you may not be happy with the fact that I'm running for a third term, but like, do you really want this guy? And that ends up kind of bearing out.
Works.
And it kind of works. So maybe it was that Roosevelt looked around and said, I might be the only one who can pull this off.
I don't think the opposition had a great rebuttal.
Yeah.
I mean, their campaign slogans were kind of like, Washington wouldn't, Grant couldn't, Roosevelt shouldn't.
Right.
Yeah, he shouldn't run isn't a strong argument.
And we should point out that even within his own party, this did cause a fair amount of consternation. I think not necessarily on the grounds of we don't think Roosevelt has been a successful president, but more on these state of democracy ideas.
I don't think any democracy is comfortable with a leader that leads for decades, that gets people into real uncomfortable territory when you have a whole generation that only knows one form of leadership. So the goal of keeping it limited to 8 years allows for multiple transitions of power and multiple leadership to take place and to shape their own agenda.
And it's a very different image of the presidency and presidential power, right? That it is the office that continues, and that it's important who fills that office, but that it is not a country ruled by one man. It is one of three equal branches of government, bringing back in Frankfurter here. And it does not require one individual to lead the country. That America is more robust than that.
Yeah. So just to sort of put a bow on this, obviously Roosevelt wins, does become a wartime president, of course, wins again, and at that point I think has a more legit argument that we I need to see this war through, but then of course dies just shortly into his fourth term, and then there's a constitutional amendment to say 2 terms and that's it.
No more.
Yeah, no more.
Which is an important reminder that norms, when they're violated, can then be backstopped with new laws. Something, just saying that in the direction of Washington, D.C., in case anyone's listening. Joe Manchin, if you're listening.
I want to tell one quick story that's sort of related to this, because my experience in covering modern politics and encountering something like this was actually, I was in New York at WNYC when Michael Bloomberg decided that he was going to run for a third term. And this was in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. He made an argument that is very resonant here, which is basically, this is my area of expertise, dealing with financial crises. I alone am the best person for this, so I'm going to change the laws. He had to actually, unravel some laws and get the city council to go with him to get us through this financial crisis. And he made that argument in the fall of 2008 into 2009. The election was in the fall of 2009, and so his argument was, this year and the next few years are going to be really big for me to help this city recover. This then led to perhaps one of my favorite moments in all of New York City politics, which was in the middle of 2009, as the recovery was going relatively well, and Bloomberg had sort of shifted his tone as things were starting to turn around. Bloomberg started going out there and saying, look, the city's coming back, the economy's recovering. He went into cheerleader mode, I think, as you would, as the mayor of New York, as you're trying to recover from the financial crisis. And Ozzie Pabra, a reporter at a press conference, raises his hand and goes, oh, so now you're telling us the economy's recovering. Does that mean your rationale for wanting a third term no longer applies? brilliant. And Bloomberg called him a disgrace, laid into him and was like, that's a ridiculous question. You're a disgrace. But, it was a legit question. It's like, your logic was, and now you're telling us this better. Anyway, I always love that moment of Michael Bloomberg causing, and the guts on Aussie paper to raise his hand and point out the fallacy there in the logic was wonderful. Of course, Bloomberg did win a third term and went on to do that and steamroll his way through. Anyway, that's my story. Bloomberg as Roosevelt. Okay, so as we start to wrap up here, let's do a couple also on these days, other things that happened on this day, July 11th. As it happens, in 1944, this is the day that Franklin Roosevelt announces that he will run for a fourth term as president of the United States. I guess that's the time of the year. I don't know if he had to get a Supreme Court justice to help him to make that announcement. 1804, this is when there was a duel between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. That doesn't get enough coverage.
I was about to say a quite esoteric topic. Yeah. Somebody should look into highlighting that a bit more.
1921, William Howard Taft is sworn in as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and is the only person to ever be president and then hold Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. I'm surprised that doesn't happen more often.
Yeah.
I mean, it would be very difficult, I think, now for a former president to become a Supreme Court justice. But the interesting thing about Taft is he was very much of a judicial mindset. And so he became president, but the Supreme Court was where he really wanted to be. So I think it's fair to say that he is the only president to use the presidency as a launching pad to the career he really wants.
He wanted a lifetime appointment.
That's right. Don't we all?
And 1979, Skylab crashes into the Indian Ocean. We should probably do that at some point, maybe next year or whenever it launches. So, do any of you know anything about Skylab?
We have a year to brush up.
Yeah, I do.
All right. Well, that brings us to the end of the episode. Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. You can get in touch with us with any questions or comments or ideas for the show. Email us thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can find a form at thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.